Thank you. I have the privilege of being able to welcome you to CU. Thank you for coming. It's a really nice university, really excellent place to come study. But it does, in some respects, represent one version of the kind of apocalypse that the rest of the world might be heading toward. This is a place that, for instance, used to have a faculty newspaper. Discontinued. It used to have a print student newspaper. Discontinued. And print, that really matters because university contexts are one place where print news is still heavily consumed and is able to have a kind of significance that is not quite met by online sources alone. There are people working on The Independent. Karina here is doing Fighting the Good Fight, an extraordinary student reporter who is working so hard to provide some real independent coverage of the major decision about the future presidency of the university that we're undergoing right now. But with hardly the resources that kind of work needs. Hardly the resources that a university community should have. And the result is you have, I see in class after class, students who don't have the experience of, oh, did you read that op-ed in the paper today? That's a vital educational experience, and it's missing here for the vast majority of students. They're not experiencing in their university community the beginnings of democratic citizenship with democratic media. This is a sign of the danger that others have talked about. It's very much happening here. Most of what I learn about the university comes from the university administration itself in our daily emails. That's not how it should be. All that said, I am going to talk less about media and its effects on democracy and its relationship to democratic society as a whole, than about democracy in media. One of the things I've been working on in recent years is looking at ways in which we can build greater democracy within the media organizations and entities that we depend on, the media utilities, the media businesses. In terms of the news in particular, I've been framing my research around what I call broad-based stakeholder ownership, a tradition in the news business that I think has been neglected. If you look at a lot of the literature and a lot of the public conversations about what is the future model of the news that's going to, swoop down from wherever and save us, you hear a lot of talk about for-profit or non-profit. Is it going to be funded by, who's the next rich person who's going to come along and fund it, fund a nonprofit? Who's the next genius who's going to figure out, the business model that we've all been waiting for so that people can make lots of money on news again? This is a tradition that has been with us really throughout the duration of the legacy of news in the United States. And it's a model that involves community ownership of different sorts. And that means that it's private business, open to investment and capital and returns on that investment. And it combines business incentives with community control. So there are three types that I'll go through. One is employee ownership, one is association ownership, and one is audience ownership. So employee ownership goes back a long time. The Horace Greeley, the namesake of Greeley, Colorado, founded as a utopian community following his inspiration. He was a great cooperativist in the period around the Civil War in New York. The New York Sun that he owned started profit sharing with its employees. By the time Greeley died, most of the paper was owned by its employees. And this was a model that a few other papers tried out in those over the years. Milwaukee Journal in 1937, Hartford Courant in 1947, U.S. News and World Report, what became that in 1962. But the real shift happened when actually a double buff, graduate of our law school here, Louis Kelso, invented a structure called the ESOP, Employee Stock Ownership Plan, that especially once it got it was first tested on a newspaper chain in the Bay Area, the Peninsula Papers, in the 50s. And then once enshrined in retirement law in 1974, really set off a wide, major boom in employee ownership conversions. And this was a really great way for newspaper owners to convert businesses to retire from their positions, but keep their news businesses in the community. So selling them to the employees, and really without the employees having to put up their own capital. Really interesting leverage strategy there. For a number of reasons that are kind of detailed and very interesting, and I think can be addressed with also kind of detailed and interesting solutions, this model did not do well in the digital turn, and nearly all of the dozens of employee-owned newspapers in this country are no longer employee-owned or no longer exist. They did not suffer the kind of crisis of the digital turn well. Nevertheless, this is a model that may see a renaissance, and we're actually having some interesting conversations about that in Colorado around the Colorado Media Project and other forces. The governor has just formed a commission to support employee ownership in the state in general. The second form is association ownership, and in some ways this is the most powerful. Many of the publications that you've heard from, for instance, are members of the Associated Press, founded in the 1840s as a cooperative of New York newspapermen who hated each other, right? But they needed, the cables going under the Atlantic Ocean were only so wide, right? And you could only get so many dots and dashes across them, right? So they had to share those cables. They had to share reports by horseback from the Spanish-American War front. And so they formed this cooperative to pool news resources. By the turn of the century, Upton Sinclair was referring to this as the most pernicious monopoly in the country. Basically, it was the Facebook of the time, right? But then through a series of court decisions, it was forced to actually operate like a cooperative, be fairer among its members and so forth. And now we think of AP as kind of the purveyor of boring non-fake news, right? Lurking in the background that nobody has to think about. And that's actually a good thing. That is a really essential utility role that cooperative model enabled, fighting off that whole time investor-backed alternatives from Hearst and all the rest of them, right? And we see that model also happening in France, in Britain, in India, around the world. That association model has been really important for creating those essential news utilities. And we're seeing some new versions of that arise, like the Colorado Sun is part of a blockchain-based, Bitcoin technology project called Civil, which is a rather rocky, not quite taking off, attempt to develop the next generation news association. And they're actually looking at things like cooperative insurance as part of the model. And the Rocky Mountain Community Radio Coalition plays a kind of role like this, enabling news organizations to band together and share resources. One wonders whether this sort of thing could be useful to address the concerns of Jonah Peretti, the founder of BuzzFeed, who was recently, just before announcing a bunch of layoffs, begging in the news for all the new media companies to come together and band together against Facebook, right? What would that look like? What would a more equitable, structure for these news organizations to survive in look like? That was one of the questions lurking in our minds when I was part of a group of people a couple of years ago who submitted a shareholder resolution to Twitter, actually, asking the company to explore options for cooperative ownership. saying this is a resource, this is a piece, a utility in our media landscape that's too important for the kind of ownership it has. It's something that should be owned differently. It should be owned, it should have democracy in its ownership. Now, the final model, which has been much less developed in this country and really around the world, is audience ownership. But this is actually taking on some new momentum right now. This is the idea that the audience, the participants in the community, might own the paper. And this is not a crazy idea. You know, one could think, for instance, about the example of the Green Bay Packers. You know, these days, football teams are basically media organizations with some players, you know, attached to them. And so it's actually a very relevant example. Starting in the 1920s, Green Bay Packers started selling shares to fans in order to finance one of the first football teams in the country. And so it's a community-owned paper, or excuse me, a community-owned team. Of course, the NFL, lest you get any ideas, has long since shut down that option for anybody else. And if you wonder why the Green Bay Packers are still in Green Bay, it's because if they ever sold, they have a poison pill that means all the proceeds would go to community nonprofits, right? But this is an example of the kind of outcome that we could imagine for news. And so there's projects like the Banyan Project, which is trying to develop cooperative models across the country for small towns. Berkeley Side and Sonoma West, two news organizations in the Bay Area, recently ran direct public offering issues that enable them to raise capital from their audiences. There's also a model developing, and it appears there may be an experiment coming up in Longmont, of an idea of info districts. So using the idea of library districts in a community to assess a tax that is then used to fund local media in that community. And that's a really nice blend between that cooperative model and public policy that's really important to recognize. I don't think that we can count on entrepreneurship alone to solve these problems. You know, in the past, the news business has relied on the postal subsidy, right? On a recognition by government that news is important enough to subsidize the production of. And we need to think about a diverse range of media organizations and smart policy that are going to support them, recognizing that this is a public good. We can't do without. Thank you.